Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come all you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad, and then Joe Stalin said...
Hello guys, I'm here joined by Professor Grover Furr, a great historian on the Soviet Union, especially the 30s era, and one of my favorite academics currently in the field of Soviet history and Sovietography. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, certainly. I teach English in the English department at Montclair State University in Montclair, New Jersey, and my specialty is medieval European literature, but I've been interested in Soviet history for many years, and in the past 20 years or so, maybe a little more, I've stopped doing research in medieval literature and just concentrated on Soviet history. And so I've published, over a dozen books in the field and a number of articles. And I think it's a very important field for all of us who are interested in changing the world for the better, to understand the real history of the Soviet Union, which is about which there are lots of lies and falsehoods spread, have been for a long time, and they continue. So we need to understand what really happened.
Of course. You have a very extensive library. What is your writing process usually like? Because I believe you published your first book, Khrushchev Lied, in like 2011, 2012?
Well, yes. Actually, it was a little earlier than that. The Russian edition came out first at the very end of 2007. I had not yet identified a publisher in the United States for the English edition, but my colleague in Moscow, Vladimir Bobrov, found a publisher in Moscow, so he translated Khrushchev Lied into Russian. And then I revised it somewhat and eventually found a publisher here in the United States. And now I have two small left-wing publishers that accept my works and publish my books.
Okay, so let's begin this. What made you begin studying Soviet history in the first place, and that shift from medieval literature to Sovietography?
Sure. Okay, well, of course, we are all multifaceted people, okay? We all have multiple interests. And I was never solely interested in medieval literature or literature. I had other interests. But let's take it back to the 1960s when I was in college and then in graduate school. I was opposed to the war in Vietnam. And I didn't understand the war in Vietnam. I didn't understand what was going on, but I knew that that it was wrong for the United States to be, fighting and killing so many Vietnamese who very obviously simply wanted independence. Vietnam had been a French colony for a long time. The French were very brutal, of course, and the United States had taken over from the French in the 1950s. I was attending a demonstration, an anti-war demonstration in New York City around about 1967. And I was standing there with a friend of mine, and we were watching this enormous demonstration walk by. At some point, we planned to join it, but it was just huge. And so we decided to wait until it had gone by. And my friend told me, maybe we should be marching with that group. He pointed to a group that was carrying the flag of the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, also called the Viet Cong, who were those who were leading the struggle against the States, fighting the war against the United States. And when he said that, a gentleman behind us, who was also watching the demonstration, said to us, you should not be opposing the American war in Vietnam. And of course, we asked him why not, and he said, because the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam is led by the Communist Party of Vietnam. The Communist Party of Vietnam is led by a man named Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was trained in Moscow by Joseph Stalin, and Joseph Stalin killed 20 million people. So neither of us really had any response to that, but I decided at some point or other I would have to look into this. And to make a long story short, in between my working on my doctoral dissertation and teaching, and those kinds of responsibilities, I decided to begin to research the Stalin period, and through a process that took a number of decades, I did manage to do some research and publish. And then in 1999, I was contacted by my now longtime colleague, Vladimir Baburov, in Moscow, because I had put one of my articles on my internet webpage. And he said, it's a very good article, but now documents from the former Soviet archives are being published. And so everything really has to be, updated, changed, questioned in the light of all of this primary source evidence that's coming out. And so he and I began to do that. During the intervening time, of course, my conviction that the history of the Soviet Union, and particularly during the Stalin period, was really vitally important, had only grown. So around about 20 years ago, I stopped doing any kind of research in literature and decided that from then on, I would just concentrate on researching the history of the Soviet Union, particularly the Stalin period, which is so, lied about so vigorously, using the evidence that the former documents in the former Soviet archives provide. And that's what I've been doing since then, with the help of Vladimir in Moscow and another colleague who's in Sweden, Sven-Erik Holmström, and I've been specializing in that ever since.
Absolutely. Why do you think Stalin haunts our, quote unquote haunts our modern day political discourse so much, right? Like Hillary Clinton will be accused of being Stalinist. Everybody under the sun is accused of being Stalinist. He seems to haunt the popular imagination.
Yeah, well, there's been a long-term campaign to do this. There was an ideological struggle in the 1920s that started even before Vladimir Lenin died in 1924 over what course the Soviet Union would take. So the Soviet Union had emerged from the revolution and then a long and very costly, very destructive civil war against the various anti-communist forces, including forces, armies from a number of the capitalist countries, including the United States, Japan, and others that wanted to crush the revolution. They were not able to do that. And the Bolsheviks, who were the party of Lenin, who led the revolution, had long thought and hoped that there would be revolutions, working class, proletarian revolutions in other countries, other developed countries, industrialized countries, and that they would help their Russian comrades, Soviet Russia, and then after 1953, the Soviet Union, they would help the Soviet Union build socialism, whatever that meant. But that didn't happen. There were no such successful revolutions. And then the question became what to do. And there was a big struggle over how to go about building socialism, which they regarded as the first step towards communism. And they did that. They fought this out. They argued, and the major figures, I suppose, ultimately became Joseph Stalin on one hand and Leon Trotsky on the other hand. And ultimately, those party members who supported Stalin were much more numerous. Stalin led the party. Trotsky was exiled from the Soviet Union. I'm being very brief here because he had formed an important faction within the party that campaigned against the party line. This was against the party rules, and he moved abroad. And therefore, afterwards, after he moved abroad, and it started even a little before that, Leon Trotsky attacked Stalin and lied about Stalin and lied about his own activities for the whole period of the 1930s. And he was successful in getting his attacks on Stalin published, not only in his own newsletter, but in many capitalist newspapers around the country. He earned some money by doing this, and so his version of Soviet history, his portrayal of Stalin became very influential. Then leaping ahead to the 1950s, Nikita Khrushchev came along with the famous or infamous secret speech in 1956 and basically said that Stalin was a really bad guy who had committed a lot of serious crimes. After Khrushchev was removed from leadership in October 1964, there wasn't a lot more said by the Soviet leadership. But by that time, Khrushchev and his men, mostly men, had published voluminously all kinds of falsehoods about Stalin and accused him of all kinds of crimes. When in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union, he almost immediately started another anti-Stalin campaign that was even more vigorous and more negative than Khrushchev's had been. And he used that, as Khrushchev had, to legitimize, justify the importation into the Soviet Union of various capitalist-oriented reforms. And to make a long story short, this process led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. So, meanwhile, in the West, as well as in the Soviet Union, these falsehoods about Stalin were widely disseminated, taught in schools, taken for granted as being true. And so that's one reason why there's such a negative view of Stalin. I think there's another reason, which is that during the period of time, roughly 25 years, let's say, that Stalin led the Soviet Union, from some time in the 20s to 1953 when he died, the Soviet Union went from being a desperately poor, mainly peasant country whose economy had been all but destroyed by the First World War, by a terrible typhus epidemic in the early 1920s, by the Civil War. the Soviet Union went from that stage to being to industrializing, to collectivizing agriculture, putting an end to this endless series of famines that struck every 3 or 4 years. Uh, Built up a powerful army. They were able to defeat the Nazi invasion, and by the end of World War II, was one of the two major powers in the world, and this was unprecedented in world history. So this, of course, was a great threat to capitalists. The fact that the Soviets were so successful in doing this, so quick to do it, and that became another motive for them to try to portray Soviet history and Stalin in the darkest possible terms.
Okay. There's this phenomenon that you've dubbed called the anti-Stalin paradigm.
Yes.
Why do you think it? First of all, of course, could you explain it? But second, like, why do you think it exists in Sovietography? Is it just because certain academics are lazy? They don't read the full sources that they're citing, as you've checked some on, in Stalin Waiting for the Truth, or is it like a more deep-rooted bias?
Yeah, it's a more deep-rooted bias. During the history of the Soviet Union, um, the only versions available of Soviet history were those put out officially by the Soviet governments, and then there were some exiles who fled the Soviet Union and wrote memoirs, but there wasn't really we didn't really have hard evidence. But the fact of the matter is that the field of Soviet history has never been mainly about discovering the truth of what was going on in the Soviet Union. I think Russian history before the Russian Revolution, before 1917, Russia was another country, and historians wrote about it. Okay, they didn't have much of a motive to falsify its history. But after the advent of this socialist state, there was a tremendous motivation to learn whatever could be learned about the Soviet Union, but also to provide propaganda for the various anti-Soviet forces in the capitalist world. And I think that motive has been the dominant motive in Soviet history, Soviet historiography, in the writing of Soviet history, ever since the Russian Revolution. So that Soviet historiography has mainly been about writing anything that would make the Soviet Union look bad, would make Stalin look bad, would make socialism and communism look like they were terrible. This kind of motive continues today, and it's only sustained by repeating accusations of crimes and so forth that can't be supported by evidence. But that has never stopped the anti-communist field of Soviet history. These historians and the works that they produced have been describing the Soviet history, and particularly the Soviet history of the Stalin period, without evidence for decades now, and it continues. I'm right now studying the couple of books by a Canadian, formerly an American, but now Canadian historian named Michael J. Carley, who teaches at the University of Montreal, who's written voluminously and basically very, very well on the how the Soviet Union was the only force that really stood up to Hitler during the 1930s. And he's used primary sources. He's gone to the French archives, he's gone to the British archives, he spent years in the Soviet archives, in Russia now, post-Soviet Russia. So he has the primary sources. So it's excellent stuff that he can prove that the Soviet Union was the only country that was prepared to really stand up to him. And Hitler was being basically encouraged by all of the other major powers in the world. But when he touches on events that are not directly about the diplomacy, the struggle to build alliances against Hitler, when he touches on things like the Moscow trials and the conspiracies of the 1930s and so forth, he just repeats the conventional wisdom. You know, all these people were really innocent. They were all framed by Stalin. And he doesn't have any evidence for that because there isn't any evidence for it. So even a really excellent historian who knows that you should stick to primary sources and who in the main does so, lapses into repeating these falsehoods about the Moscow trials, about the conspiracies, about the military conspiracy, about Stalin as a dictator, these kinds of things, which have never been supported by evidence, but he just repeats them. Now, whether he does that for what reason he does that, I assume it's because he believes it. These stories have been around for such a long time that they're taken as true. Another good example of this kind of thing is the myth of the Holodomor, the deliberate famine in the Ukraine, which was invented by the Nazis and spread by pro-Nazi Ukrainian nationalists and who have taken over the government of Ukraine since the end of the Soviet Union, and now they promote it worldwide. There's never been any evidence to support it. All of the evidence disproves it, but it's been successfully smuggled into academic and popular discourse, so that in many situations, it's just taken for granted that this event, this so-called deliberate famine, Holodomor, actually took place. And of course, it didn't. But this is, I think, typical of the historiography of the Stalin years. Has been typical of it for many years, and in large part still continues.
As we're recording right now, just a couple of days ago, the Congress, the House and Senate voted for a bill that required the teaching of totalitarianism and anti-communism in schools. Why do you think we've seen a recent rise in anti-Soviet propaganda? Has it always sort of been there and it's just sort of being reaffirmed, or are they scared of something?
During the period right after World War II, when the Soviet Union had successfully defeated the Nazi hordes and occupied Eastern Europe and was supporting revolutions for national independence in colonial possessions of the major capitalist countries all over the world, the anti-communists turned to the tactic of trying to equate communism with fascism. And that is what the concept of totalitarianism was invented to do. Okay? It was invented to say that communism and fascism are more similar than different, and that they're both, very, very different from Western-style democracy. So it's a bogus concept of totalitarianism. I think the best known historian at the origin of this was Hannah Arendt, who wrote a book titled Totalitarianism back in the 50s. Hannah Arendt was German. She certainly knew a lot about Nazism. She knew very, very little about the Soviet Union. And of course, could be Russian. But this turned out to be a very successful move on her part, and it was taken up by other political scientists and historians and ultimately into the mass media. I think it's important that people know that there is no such thing as totalitarianism. It's a bogus concept that was invented to make socialism to look as much as possible like Nazism. Mm. So, but it's been successfully spread. In fact, it's a kind of touchstone. If you're reading something or listening to a talk, and the person whose work you're reading or whom you're listening to uses the term totalitarian, you know that they're some form of right-wing anti-communist. And you also know that they are incapable of defending or proving that the validity of that term. So it's just a way of trying to say that communism or the communist movement or the socialist movement is like Nazism, is like this terrible system of mass murder and semi-enslavement, and so that's where it comes from, and that's the function it serves.
Absolutely. I should also mention that Arden was, she did not believe in the third world. She did not believe in anti-colonialism, and she often ignored the colonialism of Britain and America when factoring in
Hannah
concepts.
Arendt, Hannah Arendt played a very important and a very negative role in political theory and ultimately in public discourse. I don't want to talk too much about her. She certainly was an intelligent person, but I assume she knew what she was doing by popularizing this concept of totalitarianism. And as you say, nowadays, today, in the post-Soviet period, it's used to yoke Nazism and communism together, and therefore, in many countries of Europe, it's not yet the case in the United States, but in many countries of Europe, where it was already illegal after World War II to spread Nazi propaganda, the concept of totalitarianism made it easier for the governments of these post-Soviet societies, all of which are right-wing capitalist governments, to say, well, okay, we're also going to make it illegal to spread communist ideas, communist symbols, communist works, because we're gonna ban here not just Nazism but totalitarianism, and so it's a key word. When somebody uses that term, you know that they're unprincipled anti-communists, not interested in the truth.
So your work is obviously very controversial, and you have a lot of detractors who say you're not like a quote-unquote legitimate historian. What would you say to people who say that? And can anybody be a good historian, or should history only be reserved for like experts, quote-unquote?
Well, yeah, you warned me that question was going to come up. So here, I went to the Oxford English Dictionary, which is the most the English language in the world. Here's a page from it that I've clipped out, and I'm going to read it to you.
Okay.
Look up the term historian. A historian is a writer of history, especially one who analyzes events critically, as opposed to a chronicler or compiler, an expert in or student of history. Okay? So, historian is a writer of history. So if you write a history, so I'm a historian. But I understand what you're getting at. I think there's all kinds of suppressed assumptions made when people say, "Well, Furr is not a historian," but we don't quite know what it is they mean. In other words, do they mean that I don't have a PhD in history? Do they mean that I don't have a PhD in Russian history? Or do they mean I don't have a PhD in Soviet history of the 1930s? And if I don't have those things, nobody who lacks those things can call themselves a historian. They never spell out what that means. It's basically just an ad hominem attack. It's kind of like saying, you're ugly. You're talking nonsense. We don't have to take you serious. I think that's the way in which that claim, Furr is not a historian, is used. Now, it turns out that I do have a degree in literary history. Okay, my degree is in comparative literature, but it's in literary history. My degree is in medieval literature. Of course, that's a historical topic. But I don't like to get into that. I don't think that's the main issue. The main issue is that this is an ad hominem attack. It's a way of saying we don't have to take him seriously. But of course, they don't take me seriously. Why are they bothering with me at all?
Of course. You're a historian in my book, if that counts for anything.
Oh, I'm a historian according to the Oxford English Dictionary. I mean, it says, I read it to you, a writer of history, especially one who analyzes events critically. There you go.
Absolutely. Recently, your research has pivoted to the Great Purges and the Moscow trials. Why have you found this chapter of Soviet history so fascinating?
Well, mainly because it's been the Moscow trials have been held up for decades now, 80 years or something. Excuse me. Have been held up as sort of terrible injustices. That sort of illustrate just how terrible Stalin was and how evil Soviet communism or Soviet socialism was. So that's one reason. The other reason is that since the end of the Soviet Union, a tremendous amount of evidence, primary documentation concerning the Moscow trials and the defendants and the investigation and prosecutions and so forth has come out, and we never had that before. When Khrushchev and then later Gorbachev claimed that the defendants of the Moscow trials were innocent, they did make that claim, but they never produced any evidence that they were innocent. So what they did was they just suppressed the evidence of guilt. But now we have the evidence of guilt, and and we have a tremendous amount of it, so that it is to anyone who is interested in being objective, in learning the truth about history, and not simply in promoting anti-communist stories. To anyone like that, and I'm certainly in that category, you can't. There's no question anymore that the conspiracies that the defendants in the Moscow trials were accused of being involved in really existed. They were very serious. They were very destructive, and the Moscow trials and others trials of other people, which were not public but nevertheless took place. That these were trials of genuine conspirators, serious criminal conspirators. Now, that's simply beyond the pale. You can't say that in polite company. You can't get published in journals of history, mainstream journals of history, if you say that. In fact, a couple of months ago, I read an article in a new book on a collection of essays on Soviet history, in which one of the historians, for the first time, began to say that in the light of the evidence now available, it looks like Trotsky's movement really was infiltrated by the Nazis. That's kind of the way he put it. And So the underground Trotskyists really were, in one way or another, involved with the Nazis. And he says this in a very, very hesitant and tentative and apologetic way, because presumably he knows that this is really pushing the edge of what's acceptable in the field of Soviet history. But and I had never seen this before from a mainstream historian in mainstream academic publishing. But now there's so much evidence available that that it's simply ignored. Okay, and of course this is very important, because the Moscow trials have been and continue to be a kind of main topic of attack for those who want to say that Stalin was a brutal dictator and he was framing and executing his political enemies, all of this kind of stuff, which is all false. When you said the Great Purges, I just want to make it clear for the purpose of for you and for your listeners, there really is no such thing as the Great Purges. The word purge in Russian has to do with a vetting or an examination of party members and their activities with a view to expelling or putting on kind of temporary status any party members who had been passive, who had not been carrying out the party's line, or who had been corrupt in one way or another. Those were called the purges, and there were a number of purges. The Russian word is chistka, cleansing, which is what purge means. There were a number of these purges of the members of the Communist Party during the 1930s, to get rid of the dead wood, get rid of the members who were not really committed, and of course the penalty was there were no penalties except for expulsion from the party or being put on a temporary membership basis, pending further review in the future. But in the West, outside of Russia, the term Great Purges is carelessly used to apply to the investigations and arrests and trials of people who were involved in these anti-Soviet conspiracies. So I think it's best to use the term, to talk about the Moscow trials and not to use the term, to remind people who use the term Great Purges that it's really not an accurate term. And then finally, let me just say, as long as we're on that topic, there's this term that goes around called the Great Terror. Sometimes you'll hear that term. This was a term that was invented by Robert Conquest, who was a British first and then American historian. And he was a historian, but he was also a member of the British Secret Service and a professional anti-communist. And he wrote a book in the late 1960s called The Great Terror, Stalin's Purge of the 30s. It's about 600 pages long. He came out with a somewhat revised edition around 1990 or so. And this book was very important in my background. And of course, it's completely fallacious. I mean, a 600-page book with nothing but phony footnotes and evidence is not something you run across every day. But back then, when I read the book back in around 1970 or so, I was horrified by the statements in that book. Right, Stalin is accused of all kinds of bloody crimes. And so during the 1970s, once I had my job and was beginning to teach and working on my dissertation, I spent a lot of time in the New York Public Library in Manhattan, where they had a vast Russian collection, checking the footnotes in Robert Conquest's book. And what I found was that he didn't have any evidence. He would typically, in support of the statements he made, he would just quote some other book by somebody else who made the same statement. And of course, that's not evidence, right? In other words, if I say, here's John Smith, he's accused of murder, and John Smith says, well, what's the evidence? And you say, well, there's old Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones says you're a murderer. And here's another guy, Mr. Roberts, and he also says you're a murderer. So that's my evidence that you're a murderer. Well, of course, that's ridiculous, right?
Right.
You're going to need more than that. Well, you need more than that in general. You need to have evidence, not simply that expert A agrees with expert B, agrees with expert C. That's not evidence. So I guess that Conquest's book, in a negative sense, was very important in my development, so to speak, towards concentrating in Soviet history, because once I realized that book was a fraud from beginning to end, fraud in the sense that it made only that evidence, just mainly by quoting, what Khrushchev's men had said, and they made their statements without evidence. Of course, I checked them too. That really convinced me that this is a field that is very corrupt. I also read a lot of reviews of that book in the professional historical journals. In the early 1970s, it was reviewed by a number of journals, and a few of the reviewers said, well, he doesn't have very good evidence, but on the whole, this is a great book. And of course, it was a great book for the purposes it served. It was supposed to be a work of anti-communist propaganda, kind of like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a book that has no validity whatsoever, but that can be quoted in the media by the popular and semi-popular press, can be taught in college classrooms, or college professors and maybe even high school teachers can take so-called facts, can take those statements and use them in their courses and use them for propaganda purposes. And that was really what it was all about. And that convinced me, that as much as anything else convinced me, that I needed to spend serious time doing real research. Because after all, I had been trained to do serious primary source research on medieval history, medieval literary history. So I knew what evidence was and how to go about getting it. And these people didn't have it and hadn't used it. So, and then my colleague, contacted people like Earl Moscow, told me that documents from the former Soviet archives had begun to be made available, published. I knew that this was tremendously important. Now we could go back and check. We could go back and see what the evidence says, not just what Khrushchev said, but what others. So I wrote that book, Khrushchev, because I discovered that the accusations that Khrushchev made against Stalin and also against could not be sustained by the evidence that we now have available. And that was a real eye-opener for me, and I guess for some others.
So you've made your work has delved into a lot of state narratives that have sort of formed after the fall of the Eastern Bloc, right? Katyn massacre, Holodomor. Could you just go over the evidence you found against these common right-wing capitalist state narratives? Yeah.
Well, okay. Let me do the Holodomor first because it's easy. There's never been any evidence whatsoever that there was a deliberate famine. There, of course, was a big famine, and it wasn't confined to Ukraine. It was in other parts of Russia. It was probably even more severe in Kazakhstan, which at that time was a republic of the Soviet Union, than it was in Ukraine. It was picked up, and not the term, but the idea that this was a famine that either the Soviet government had deliberately fostered, or at least was not dealing with, was picked up by by the Germans, by the Nazis in the 1930s, and then by the Ukrainian nationalists who had escaped the Soviet Union and had been permitted to immigrate to Western countries like Canada, the United States, West Germany, Great Britain, and so forth. They started to use this term mainly in the 1980s. So why do I reject it? Well, A, there was never any, if you read their works, there's never any evidence of it. And B, there's a professor at the University of West Virginia named Mark Tauber, who is has devoted his life to studying Russian and Soviet agriculture. And by the way, he's not a leftist. He's not nobody could call him a Stalinist. He's just a really good historian. And it just so happens that when he was doing his doctoral work in the late 80s and early 90s, he chose to do it on Soviet agriculture without knowing that once the Soviet Union fell apart, nobody thought that was going to happen at that time, that the Ukrainian nationalists were now going to popularize this idea that there had been a deliberate famine. So he's an expert on this, and his works are available, widely available on the internet and, of course, in print. He's a great scholar. I've studied his research, which is excellent. He shows that not only was there no deliberate famine, but that the Soviet government did a great deal to stop the famine, and that, in fact, the collectivization of agriculture was essential in order to prevent future devastating famines which had dogged Russian history for hundreds and hundreds of years. So that was a lot of more. The Katyn massacre, I knew that I would have to do something about that because the Katyn massacre is normally regarded as the best evidenced crime of Stalin. Okay, the best crime of Stalin demonstrated by evidence. That's the way it's normally approached, and it is considered taboo, virtually, in the field of Soviet studies to question Soviet guilt at Katyn. Okay, if you question Soviet guilt at Katyn, you're considered like a nutcase, like a denier of the Holocaust of the Jews, right? You should be beyond the pale. So I knew that I would have to investigate this, and when I investigated, I found out that the evidence is that the Soviets did not do it, and therefore the Germans must have done it. Now, in my opinion, and of course that's not going to be accepted in the mainstream of Soviet history, it's just going to be rejected. And I'm going to be insulted, called a Stalinist, called a denier of the Holocaust, a dishonest, and all this kind of stuff, because you can't question that. You're not supposed to question that. But at the present stage of investigation, and there really isn't anyone that I can see in the world who are still investigating Katyn. At the present stage of investigation, the evidence just does not support Soviet guilt. Just recently, in the last few weeks, I was looking at some of the excavations that were made after the end of the Soviet Union in the places where, according to the mainstream view, the Soviets were supposedly burying these Polish prisoners of war whom they are alleged to have massacred. And the Polish government made these excavations and they couldn't find the bodies. So if that's pretty good evidence that the mainstream story of how the Soviets killed all these people, the Soviet NKVD killed all of these Polish prisoners and then buried them in these places which are identified. It's a pretty good evidence that story is false. So I think it's important to question received opinion. I didn't know when I started to do this research on Katyn that I would discover that the Soviets were innocent. I was prepared to find out they were guilty. Maybe they really did shoot all of these Polish prisoners. I mean, what's it to me, right? I was interested in solving the mystery, and that's what I call my book, right? The mystery of the Katyn massacre, the evidence, the solution. I was interested in approaching this like Sherlock Holmes or some other detective. Let's take a look at the evidence. Let's isolate it. Let's identify it. Let's study it. Let's see what it says. But that's not what Soviet studies is all about. That's not what the Katyn massacre is all about. The Katyn massacre uses a big stick to attack the idea of communism, to attack Stalin, to attack the Soviet Union, and nowadays in Poland, right-wing nationalist government uses it to attack Russia, as though somehow or rather Vladimir Putin is in some way or other responsible. So it's one of those horror stories, like the Holodomor, like the Moscow trials, that is widely accepted because it's been widely propagandized for a long time. And people understand, people in the field of Soviet studies and beyond understand that if you question that, you will be regarded as some sort of Stalinist or some sort of Holocaust denier, some dishonorable and dishonest person. But that's a challenge, isn't it?
Right. And what did you find actually happened, as according to official sources that claim that the Soviet Union did Katyn?
The interesting thing about this is that nobody's looking. I wasn't looking for who did it. I was looking at the evidence that has been brought forward, on the Katyn massacre, which it has been said, it is still said, proves Soviet guilt. And what I found was that it doesn't prove Soviet guilt. There is some evidence that indicates that the Germans were responsible, but as for a more thorough investigation of German records, for example, or even an objective, dispassionate study of the mass graves at Katyn itself, this has not taken place. For example, let me just give you one example. Okay, so in the German report of 1943, where they are accusing the Soviets of having killed all of these Polish prisoners, and they disinterred, they dug up over 4,000 bodies. The German report claims that there was only one type of shell casing found. And okay, that's very unlikely, and I go into how unlikely it is in my 2013 article, and then in my 2017, I guess, or 2018 book. Very unlikely that thousands of men could be shot to death and only use one kind of cartridge. The other issue is that we know from other excavations, from other archaeological investigations of mass graves of people shot by the Nazis, shot by the Germans. We know that the Germans were using shells that were dated. The head stamp, which is the part of the shell that has the percussion cap in the middle, right? The head stamp, around the head stamp of these shells, was information about where the shells were manufactured and the date. And in the German report, they say, well, this is what's used, but they give you photographs, but only of the side of the bullet. They don't give you the sides of the shell casings. They don't give you photographs of the bottoms of the shell casings. And then when they do present depictions of the bottoms of the shell casings, they're drawings. And they're drawings that show shells that don't have any dates on them. Now, that's just unlike. Also, of course, there's the interesting question that even the Germans claimed that when the Soviets shot all of these men, we don't know how many thousands because they only dug up 4,000 bodies, but there presumably were a lot more than that. When the Germans claimed, and the mainstream version of Katyn claims today, that the Soviets used exclusively German ammunition. Why would the Soviets use German ammunition? And why didn't the Germans show the shell casing? So I would like to see, but I don't think we're going to see it anytime soon, another excavation at the site of Katyn, where we know that there is thousands of bodies there. The bodies are got bad shape now, but I'm not so much interested in the bodies. There must be other shell casings. And if there are, my guess, those shell casings would have identifiable marks on them. And if the identifiable marks are German and they're dated, as the shell casings at other sites of German massacres are, then we'll know that the Germans did it. But of course, they're not doing that. The Poles didn't do that. The Russian government hasn't done that. I'm not sure why they haven't done it. So there is no serious investigation into into who was responsible. The only serious investigation ever carried out was carried out by the Soviets in 1943-44. And of course, that's the Budenko Commission report. Now, of course, it concludes that the Germans killed the Poles. But because it's a Soviet study, it's routinely dismissed. So in my book, I studied that very carefully, just like I studied the German report very carefully. And so I think this is what you have to do when you're going out to try to discover the truth. You need to take a look at all the evidence. You need to try to be objective, and you need to draw your conclusions from the evidence. And so that's what I attempted to do in the question of Katyn. But the issue is this. Just let me say it one more time. It's taboo. It's beyond the pale to question Soviet guilt at Katyn. You'll immediately be called a Stalinist, a dishonest person, a dishonorable person, a Holocaust denier, all of this kind of stuff, and that's what happens.
Okay. One more major sort of myth or a common narrative you've tackled is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which is it's often portrayed as like Stalin and Hitler mutually deciding to invade Poland. What evidence did you find against that, and what was how did you form sort of a counter narrative, a more truthful narrative?
Sure. Well, I back in 2009, I guess it was, I wrote a long article about this, and at that time I thought that the internet would be a good way to a good venue to put research articles on. All right. I don't think it's that. I don't think that anymore. I don't think it's proven to be such a good venue, but I thought it was there. And also, I wanted to give a couple of talks about this. So I did the research, and I put an article on my webpage. And if you go to my homepage, which you can easily find by a Google search, and you look down the page to around 2009, 2010, you'll see a link to that article that I wrote and researched then. And that I went back and looked at the primary sources and came to the conclusion that, of course, the normal story about the Soviets and the Germans getting together and deciding to divide up Poland was completely false. Well, since then, of course, I've done a lot of other work, and right now I'm in the last stages of researching and writing a book on the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which I expect to be published in 2025. I'm not sure exactly when, maybe in the summer, maybe in the fall, but it's basically researched and written at this point. And I go into all of the evidence. As you probably know, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which is a non-aggression pact signed on August the 23rd, 1939, between Germany and the Soviet Union, does not call for any kind of joint invasion, and there was no joint invasion. In fact, the Germans basically told the Soviets at one point, I'm going to, kind of be very brief here. The Germans basically told the Soviets that if they didn't send the Red Army in to occupy Western Ukraine and Western Belarus, which had been taken over by Poland in 1921 and were then part of Poland, if they didn't do that, then other states would be formed in those areas. And now we know what they meant by that. What they meant was that the Germans would have formed an anti-communist Ukrainian nationalist state, very anti-Soviet, allied with the Germans and so forth. And of course, the Soviets couldn't have. Also, on September 17th, 1939, the Polish government did a uniquely unprincipled thing. They crossed the border from what was then Poland into Romania. And in so doing, they were interned in Romania. Romania had normal relations with Germany, and of course, therefore, could not house a government in exile of Poland that was hostile to Germany, because that would be an act hostile to Germany too. So once the Polish army had crossed the border, and it happened on the 17th of September 1939, Poland no longer had a government. And what that meant was that Poland, under international law, was no longer a state. And the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had been a pact, or at least the secret codicil, was a pact over spheres of influence in the state of Poland. So the Germans informed the Soviets that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was not valid anymore, because there was no more state of Poland. There was no more Polish state, and therefore the German army could have come right up to the Soviet border, unless the Red Army came in to occupy these territories. And one final thing, of course, there's a principle in law called rebus sic statibus, which is Latin for as long as or if affairs remain the same. So once Poland was defeated by Germany, the Polish government had left the country, then any international treaties that defined the Polish state, that defined the Polish borders, were no longer valid. So the Soviets came in to what was then Eastern Poland, what had until 1921 been the Western Soviet Russia, in order to keep the German armies 300 kilometers or so away from the Soviet border, to prevent hostile Ukrainian nationalist state from being formed in that area. And they violated no law in doing so, and they certainly had never agreed with the Germans to do it. It seems to me that what the outcome that the Soviets expected was this: that the German army would defeat the Polish army pretty rapidly, and the Polish government would then retreat to the east into eastern Poland, and there they could set up a government, a government of a rump state, that is, a state that was only about half the size that it had been. And they could do that because under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the German armies were to stay in Western Poland. They were not permitted to come to Eastern Poland. That was the Soviet sphere of influence. And if the Polish government had done that, then there would have been a Polish state. It would have been on the Soviet border as a kind of anti-German buffer state to keep the German army away. That would have been very beneficial to the Soviet Union. But instead, the Polish government fled to Romania, went into interned themselves into internment, leaving Poland without a state, and therefore the Soviets really had no choice but to enter. By the way, I reproduce in my online article, it's on my webpage, to say look down to around the year 2009, reproduce the New York Times article, where the New York Times reporter, who is Polish at that time, has a Polish name, says more or less all of this stuff. This is what he said. He said, this problem wouldn't have existed if the Polish government hadn't fled Poland and interned itself in Romania. So I don't think there's any doubt about that. But of course, it's lied about. Okay? It's this version of history, the true version, the objective version, is not discussed. Instead, this is used as another dishonest way to try to equate Stalin and Hitler. And there's a famous David Low cartoon published in the British newspapers at the time, which pictures Stalin and Hitler shaking hands over this dead body, which is labeled Poland. Mm. That was the propaganda version in the anti-communist West at that time. The only voice of any consequences in the West that disagreed with that version happened to be Winston Churchill, who basically said it was good that the Soviets did this. It's in our interest that they did this. But nobody paid any attention to him then, and they don't appear not to be paying any attention to him today.
Okay. Forgive me if this is a little bit outside of your field of research, but I also know that there was a Polish government in exile in London. What kind of role did it play in all of this?
Well, okay. The Polish government, the Polish government in London, exile in London, was first it went to France. First, okay. A Polish government in exile was formed around the Polish embassy in Paris. And then, of course, at a certain point of May to June 1940, the German army, Hitler's army, invaded Belgium and France. And then the Polish government in exile fled to England, where it remained. It was recognized by the Allies. It was not recognized by the Soviet Union, of course, until Germany declared war on the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941. Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. And then then of course, France and Britain were already at war with Germany. So after the invasion, the Soviet Union was at war with Germany. So the Soviet Union recognized the government in exile, which at that point was in England. The problem being with the government in exile in England is it was made up of fanatically anti-communist forces who, in fact, were more pro-German than they were, pro-Ally. They were at war with Germany formally, of course, but they didn't do much fighting. The Polish underground in Poland didn't do much fighting, and particularly, and the reason is that the Polish government in exile made the estimate that the Allies would win the war. And if the Allies won the war, if Germany was defeated, then their main enemy, the Polish nationalists' main enemy, would not be Germany. what would be the Soviet Union. So this became particularly acute at times, for example, of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, the uprising of Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto who were being gradually starved and also deported to death camps and so forth. And there was a serious uprising in October 1943. The Polish government in exile was pressured by the British to send messages to the Polish underground in Poland to give assistance to the Polish government, to the Warsaw Ghetto rebels. And the Polish underground in Poland were so anti-Semitic that they either gave no aid or they eventually ended up giving an incredibly small amount of aid to the Jewish rebels in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. Then after February 1943, the defeat of the huge German army at Stalingrad, it became obvious to everyone that, including the Germans, that Germany was going to lose them. And then the Polish government in exile put into effect an operation which they called Operation Storm, Storm Polish. And this was an operation where they would tell the Polish underground in Poland not to fight the Germans. The Germans were retreating. The Germans were going to lose. Let the Allies defeat the Germans. Let the Soviet army defeat the Germans. To save your resources so that when the Red Army approaches, you'll be in a position to oppose it. And the way they planned to oppose it was this, Operation Storm. The idea was that the Polish underground was instructed to wait until the German army had retreated from a given city, and they would do that when the Red Army was close by. Wait until the Germans abandoned the city, retreated, and then, before the Red Army had a chance to occupy the city, any city you want, the Polish underground was instructed to storm the municipal building, the city hall, the buildings associated with government, and to declare that they were now the legitimate government. That is, the Polish government in exile was now the legitimate government. And this would either stop the Soviets from setting up their own pro-Soviet government in those areas, or if the Soviets did insist on tossing out the Polish underground, setting up their own government, the Polish government in exile would complain to the Allies that the Soviets were doing this. Now, this plan didn't work, but that was the plan. And it accounted for the fact that the Germans were able to basically destroy Warsaw and suppress the Warsaw uprising in August and September, the end of July, August and September 1944. Not the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. That took place the previous year. Okay. Warsaw uprising. The Polish underground in Warsaw, the capital of Poland, right, was instructed, according to Operation Storm, to wait until the Red Army was about to enter the city and then seize the government buildings. And the leader of the Polish underground in Poland was told by one of his intelligence officers that the Red Army had crossed the Vistula River, Wisla, on which, Warsaw is on the west side, and the Red Army was on the east side. But the Red Army had crossed the river, which is a big barrier, of course, and therefore was about to take Warsaw, and therefore the Polish underground should start an uprising with the goal of seizing the city or the major buildings in the city and declaring that city was now ruled by the Polish government in exile. The trouble was that the Red Army had not crossed the river, and the commander of the Polish underground in Warsaw gave the order for the uprising to start. But the Red Army had not crossed the river, and the Germans were still in the city with considerable force. And so for a month or so, the Polish underground had to fight against the heavily armed German army, and they were, of course, badly defeated. Much of the city was destroyed. And ever since, they've been blaming the Soviets for this. The Polish nationalists claim that the Soviets deliberately stayed on the eastern side of the Vistula River to let the Germans defeat the Polish underground before crossing the river. So I did some research into that. I wasn't the first one to do it. And I published the results of that research. And that's all false. That's completely false. Even anti-communist Polish military men at the time said that this was false. But that story is still part of the anti-communist sort of version of World War II, and it's an article of faith in today's right-wing anti-communist Poland that the Soviets did this, along with the Katyn massacre, things like that. It's completely false.
Okay. And finally, I don't know how much more time you have.
I know you're. That's okay. I'm here.
Okay. You found evidence that there actually was a conspiracy, and that the Moscow trials were onto a real conspiracy, as opposed to like the staged thing that's often been presented. What evidence have you found for that conspiracy?
Well, I have a whole book called The Moscow Trials as Evidence. It's one of my books. And I published that book, I don't know, almost 10 years ago now. Okay? There was a lot of evidence then. So I recommend that book to you. It wouldn't be a bad idea. I mean, I have no current plans to do it, but it wouldn't be a bad idea to revise that book, because since then, in the last 10 years, there's been an enormous amount of evidence of the, drawn up against the defendants in those trials has been made available, has been published either on the web or in books. Just an enormous amount of stuff. And I've written about some of this in my last two books on Leon Trotsky, for example. We now have lots of evidence that Trotsky really did collaborate with the Germans and Japanese, that Trotsky's followers in the Soviet Union really were involved in these conspiracies. So I have a book called More Evidence of Trotsky's Conspiracy, and another book called Evidence of Leon Trotsky's Conspiracy with Germany and Japan. Those are two separate books. And at some point, I'm going to write another book about that kind of thing. But my latest book with Vladimir Bobrov, the one that just came out a few months ago, is called Trotsky's Comintern Conspiracy. And we go through an enormous amount of evidence that Trotsky's followers in the Communist International were involved in a very serious conspiracy to smuggle intelligence to the Germans and Japanese, to smuggle money to Trotsky abroad, taking them out of Comintern budget. We're doing all kinds of very harmful things. And I was able to write that book, and I did write it for the most part, because my colleague in Moscow, Vladimir Bobrov, has been going to the NKVD archives to get the investigative materials. In other words, before you're going to declare somebody guilty or innocent of a crime, you want to look at the evidence, right? So the evidence is in the old NKVD archive, which is now housed in the same building. It's now called the Federal Security Service, the FSB in Russia, but it's still basically the same operation. And this material is gradually being declassified. It is difficult to use because it's not being published. It's simply sitting there. And if you go to this library in Moscow and you ask for certain things, you might get it. You might, because it's not well cataloged, it's not well inventoried. My colleague Vladimir, who deserves all the credit in the world for this, and he has another colleague there, Alexander Shkalov, they have developed a good relationship with the librarians, the archivists at this archive, so that they have been able to obtain a lot of these documents, a lot of this evidence. Now, it's not like you can go in there and Xerox it. This is not like an American library. It's not like you can take photographs of it. You have to copy it out by hand. And so Vladimir has been copying this material out by hand for years, and then going home and retyping it, putting it in the original format, and sending it to me. And I study it. I've translated a lot of it into English. Much of it is in, dozens of pages of it are in our latest book, Trotsky's Commentary on Conspiracy. And he continues to do that. And then a few years ago, in 2018 to be exact, the transcript of the trial of the military conspirators, the Tukhachevsky, Marshal Tukhachevsky and other high-ranking Red Army officers who were arrested in March and April 1937, put on trial, got interrogated in May 1937 and June 1937, put on trial on June the 11th, 1937, found guilty and executed. The transcript of that trial has been declassified. And Vladimir had been asking for this for years and not been told that he couldn't see it. And then suddenly it was not only declassified, but it was put online, put on the internet. So in our book, Trotsky and the Military Conspiracy, we put together a large amount of evidence that this conspiracy was genuine. And at the end of it, in the appendix, we translate into English the entire text of the trial transcript, where these high-ranking Army officers talk, confess, talk to each other, talk to the court about their contacts with Trotsky, their contacts with the Germans, how they were planning to stab the Red Army in the back, planning uprisings, all kinds of stuff. There's no reason to think that this was dictated. This is really important evidence. So that's another book that we came out with. The three of us came out with in 2020.
Okay. Have you found other countries' historiographies of the Stalin era are better, like Russian historiography of the Stalin era? Have you found that's a little bit better, or is it about the same? Is anti-Stalinism sort of a global paradigm?
It's the norm in the West. You can't question it in the West. In Russia, because of course the Russians were the ones who made the Russian Revolution, there is still a little room. There is still a space, if you want, for researchers to research and publish materials that along the lines that I do, that looking at the evidence and drawing conclusions that basically prove that Stalin was not guilty of all of the crimes of which he's been accused. That space does not exist in Russian academia, but outside of academia, historians, well, let's say like me, I'm not outside of academia in the sense that I teach English in college, but I don't teach Russian history. Okay, I couldn't do that in the United States. What I published would not be tolerated in a department of history. But because I'm not in the department of history, I can do it. So if you're outside of academia in Russia, there's a sizable though minority space where pro Stalin material, if you want to call it that, or material that questions the anti-Stalin paradigm is accepted. And also to some extent, and I'm not sure how great the extent is, but to some extent in China.
Okay.
So except for that though, and of course, there are little leftist groups here and there around the world who have decided that they are looking at the Stalin period positively, and they put material out. But if you're talking about serious research works, it's as I just described.
Okay. I know that primary sources, especially the Soviet archives that have been opened up, are important to your work. What are the positives of primary sources, these primary sources that have been opened up, and are there any limitations to them?
There are always limitations.
Okay.
I'm often accused of naively accepting confessions as though somehow confessions are different from other evidence. But the fact, in other words, maybe these people were tortured or threatened into confessing. I deal with this in that book, The Moscow Trials, as evidence. This is a very naive view. The fact of the matter is that all evidence can be faked. All right? We know that evidence in certain cases has been faked. There's fake evidence in the case of Katyn. Read my book about that. A couple of years ago, Vladimir and I published a book called Stalin Exonerated, Fact-Checking the Death of Solomon Mikhoels, where we show that the documentation, supposedly from the Soviet archives, that Stalin ordered the assassination of a famous at that time theater director, Solomon Mikhoels, in Russia in 1948, January 1948. We show that these documents are phony. They're forgeries. It was not hard to show them that they're forgeries. But once again, you can't say that. Okay, that is a given that Stalin ordered Solomon Mikhoels to be assassinated, and regardless of the evidence, and we have the evidence, read it. It is unacceptable to say that. I do discuss in all of my books how to deal with the evidence of confessions, because of course confessions can be faked, as can any other kind of evidence. Sometimes critics of mine, if you want to put it that way, people who assault my position will say, well, there was no material evidence used by the prosecution in the Moscow trials. Ilya Trotsky wrote that, and people, not just Trotskyists, but them too, just repeat it as though it's true. If you read the 600-page transcript of the 1937 trial, which is the Trotskyist trial, and then the 800-page transcript of the 1938 trial, the so-called Bukharin-Rykov trial, you'll see that the Soviet prosecutors did bring forth material evidence, notebooks, passports, this kind of thing. That's what's meant by material evidence. Why Why say the Soviets didn't bring forth material evidence when they did? Well, one reason I think is that very few people are going to sit down and study a 600-page transcript and then go and study an 800-page transcript. Okay, that's very long. That's a lot of work. You have to be powerfully motivated to do it. So they're not going to read them, and therefore, when somebody says, like Trotsky says, or some Trotskyite says, or some anti-communist scholar says, well, there's no material evidence, they'll just take their word for it. In fact, it is cited there. But the other issue, of course, is that material evidence can also be fabricated. So, what makes that so special? It might even be easier to fabricate material evidence. Put some skilled people in a room and tell them to fabricate the evidence, and in a week or two, they can fabricate the evidence for you. Might be easier to do that than to get dedicated lifelong revolutionaries to confess to terrible crimes that they never committed. That, and not only that, but argue with each other about it. You did this, no, you did it this way, you did it that way. If you take the 1938 trial, which is the most famous defendant in the March 1938 Moscow trial, the third Moscow trial, is Nikolai Bukharin. Nikolai Bukharin spent most of his testimony vigorously denying accusations that the prosecutor, Andrei Dyshinsky, wanted to convict him of. And he spent most of his testimony denying, in the strongest possible terms, these accusations, while at the same time he confessed to many very serious crimes in that same trial, at that same trial. But there were certain crimes he refused to confess and strongly insisted that he was innocent of. Now, if he had been threatened with torture, or if his family had been threatened, why would he do that? Why would he spend most of his testimony denying what the prosecution wanted him to say? Okay? It doesn't compute. It doesn't add up. And in fact, in 2001, there was an article published in Russia, not here, by Stephen Cohen, the late Stephen Cohen, who is a renowned and very anti-Stalin Soviet historian of the Soviet Union. First at Princeton, then at New York University, and back at Princeton again. He died a few years ago. He published an article in Russian, in a Russian history journal, in which he says it very briefly, but I read the article. He says, it seems clear that Bukharin was not tortured. Because what was Bukharin doing when he wasn't being interrogated? He was sitting in prison, awaiting more interrogations and then eventually the trial and eventually his execution. He was writing. He was writing poetry. He was writing works of philosophy. These have all been published since the end of the Soviet Union. Are we to believe that, they would take him and torture him, and then he would go back and start writing philosophy and poetry, and then they would torture him again? Anyway, the whole idea is ridiculous. Okay? But Bukharin implicated dozens of other people, just like dozens of people had implicated him. Okay? And then, after he was convicted, after they were all convicted in the 1938 trial, all of the defendants wrote appeals. You could, in the Soviet system, write an appeal of your conviction. Okay? You could appeal to the Supreme Court. And Bukharin wrote an appeal. And he actually wrote two of them. And they've been published. And in those appeals, he says, I'll serve the Soviet state, I'll attack Trotsky, I'll do all kinds of wonderful things if you let me do it. You don't execute me. But he says, again, for my crimes, I should be shot 10 times over. That was his appeal. And this was his chance to say, listen, I confessed dishonestly to various crimes. Now you've got to reward me or something. He didn't say that, right? and he spent most of his time denying his accusations. There's just no way that these confessions were not genuine, and we have so many of them. When Bukharin was under investigation in 1937, 1936, he said that confessions of his former co-conspirators were piling up. One day he says this in a transcript of the March 1937 Central Committee meeting. He says, one day I received 20 confession statements by his co-conspirators. And then at the trial, he says, part of his last words, everybody got a last word. Part of what he says is, people will ask why, I'm quoting almost verbatim, people will ask why I confessed. He says, well, of course, the evidence is a major reason. And then he goes on and says, the confession of the accused is not essential for conviction. He says, the idea that you have to get the accused to confess before you can condemn him is a medieval idea. So he recognized that that's the other thing he said. He said, there's just too much testimony against him, right? All of these people testifying against him, dozens of them. What are you going to say? Well, they're all lying. I mean, that no court in the world would accept that. If you're in a criminal conspiracy, and 8 or 10 other people say, yeah, Radwani, he was there, right? He was there. We saw him. He did this. You're cooked.
Right.
You can say you're innocent, but nobody's going to believe it. If all of these guys are spilling the beans on you. And that, of course, is a big part of investigations everywhere, right? You investigate one guy and you try to see if he names any names, and then you go and investigate those people. They say, there's no way that this stuff was faked. People say, oh, he's a Stalinist. They say that about me. So therefore, he ignores the difficulties in evaluating this evidence. No, I don't. You just have to read my stuff. But a lot of people don't.
Of course. And could you just very, very briefly summarize how the Soviet judicial system worked? Is it very similar to ours, where we have like a jury,
it's
a judge?
To the European, similar, not to the Anglo-American system. It's more similar to the Napoleonic system. It's not identical to the Napoleonic system, but it's a similar system. You've got a prosecutor, but you have a prosecutor, and you have a prosecutor. You have a defense. You have one thing that's important to remember, and it comes up in our latest book, and of course it comes up in this Confessions of Bukharin that I just mentioned to you. In the Soviet system, you could, there'd be this preliminary investigation with transcripts of confession statements, or if you fail to confess, transcripts of the interrogation. And at the end, the accused was supposed to stand to sign it, to read over the transcript, because of course they record these in shorthand. Somebody taking it down in shorthand, and it'd be, retyped. They read it over and signed each page. But and then before you went to trial, all of the investigative materials that the investigation had produced were given to you, and you were allowed to study it and then sign a piece of paper saying, yes, I have studied, I have been presented with the investigation materials, and I have studied them. And that comes up in the trial too. They ask, have you seen these materials? Did you study them? You say, yes. But when you get to trial, you can say to we're talking about the Soviet Union in the 1930s. You get to trial, you can tell the court, I retract my confessions. Even if you've confirmed them up to that point, you can say, I retract my confessions. In which case, your confessions cannot be used against you in the trial. But you can't retract what other people confessed about you, right? You can't retract, in the case of Bukharin, it says, all of these people confessing against me, making all these statements against me. There's no way to deal with that. Okay, he could have said, "Well, I retract my confessions," but he didn't say that. But some of the defendants did say that. The Nikolai Yezhov, the head of the NKVD, who had his own conspiracy going, was put on trial in February 1940. He retracted his confessions. He had proved them all the way through, but then when he got to trial, he retracted them. He retracted them, which meant that the prosecution had to bring other witnesses, other testimony, and so forth and so on against him. But that's what you're talking about now. Now, the other big difference is in these trials, these particular trials, which were very serious trials, basically treason trials. There was a trial before a panel of judges, not before a jury. So that's a big difference between the Napoleonic system and the Anglo-American system. Okay, it's a big difference. It's not a trial by jury; it's a trial by judges. And France, other European countries have somewhat similar systems today.
Okay.
Italy.
Okay, so it's pretty standard in Europe.
It's standard European, but it's not the Anglo-American system, which
Okay.
has evolved since Magna Carta. Since King John in 1215 signed the Magna Carta, where the barons said you can't put any of us on trial unless we have a jury of our peers. That's where the whole jury system starts.
Oh, okay. Besides your work, are there any other historians, authors, or researchers that you really admire and recommend on the Stalin era?
Yeah, I mean, I recommend all of them. Okay, so no professional scholar in the field of Soviet history is free of the restrictions of the anti-Stalin paradigm. You have to say bad stuff about Stalin somewhere along the line, right? That being said, there are some that are, as long as you sort of set that stuff aside, there are some that are good. I just mentioned Michael Carlin, when he's investigating the diplomacy of the 1930s, where the Soviets were trying to form an alliance of Western powers against Hitler. As long as he's working with the primary sources, he's great. When he says, "Oh well, the Moscow trials, they were all frame-ups," and he didn't have any evidence. He's not studying the Moscow trials, so he just says, "Well," or he comes along and said, "Well, who the hell knows why Stalin killed all these people? Who knows why he executed Marshal Tukhachevsky? What was he thinking of?" But he doesn't investigate those things. March Getty is very good, when he's discussing primary sources. Wendy Goldman at Carnegie Mellon is very good, again, when she's investigating primary sources. William Chase at the University of Pittsburgh. I think Louis Siegelbaum is retired, but he was at Michigan. He was very good. But again, when they're discussing primary sources and analyzing primary sources, okay, but they all have to salt their works with anti-Stalin stuff, okay, not supported by evidence. In fact, a number of them debunk some anti-Stalin tales here and there. You have to do that. But I draw a very strong line between them and the professional anti-communists like Timothy Snyder, like Stephen Kotkin, these people that I should have mentioned Mark Tauger. I did mention him earlier. He does wonderful work on Soviet agriculture and Russian agriculture. Very, very good. But I draw a strong line between them and the professional anti-communists, who are, very influential. Kotkin and Snyder are extremely influential. If anybody is, if you want to read about Soviet history of the 1930s, not social history, I'm talking about the kind of history that I've been working with, the history of the high politics of the I mean, that's what I invested in. Look at the bibliography of some of my books. These are some of the most important names, and there are others that are, sometimes have good material, and sometimes, but if you pick up this works on Soviet history, you have to look to see what the evidence is. What evidence are they citing? And unfortunately, what that often, if not usually, means is you have to go out and get the books or articles that they cite, and then look at them to see if they really say or they really demonstrate what the scholar who you're reading says. So that's what I did in my book, Blood Lies, which is a critique of Timothy Snyder's famous book called Bloodlands, which was published in 28 languages around the world and won all kinds of prizes. He's at Yale. That's what I did in my book, Stalin Waiting for the Truth, which was a critique of Stephen Kotkin's book, Stalin Waiting for Hitler. And these two guys still continue to publish stuff, and you can't trust a thing you say. You have to check every footnote, which, but who's going to do that? Who's going to do that? Not many people. I do it. And that's what's necessary, because the kind of stuff that goes on in the history of the Soviet Union. I have been told by people who are experts in German history, the history of the Nazi people, that this is not much of a problem there. That the research that's done is based on primary sources. They're not going out, the historians don't go out of their way to curse and say bad things about Hitler. Everybody knows that Hitler was a bad guy, so they don't worry about that. Okay, but when it comes to the communist movement, anti-communism is still very, very strong, and the necessity of adhering to the anti-Stalin paradigm and saying negative things about Stalin is required.
Okay, so as long as you keep a critical eye, there's a myriad of historians that you can look at, as long as they're using primary source evidence.
Once you start running across negative statements about Stalin, start looking for the footnotes. Start seeing it's based on. What is the evidence here? I do that all the time, and you know what? I've been doing this now. I mean, I've been doing research on the Soviet Union since the 1970s. On and off, and it's more or less full time in my research for the last 20 or 21 years. The fact of the matter is that I have yet to find evidence of a single crime that Stalin committed. Now, I expected to find some, because I mean, what politicians don't commit crimes? I mean, let's face it, right? What leaders of states don't commit crimes? But I haven't found any. And in a way, I'm kind of sorry that I haven't, because if I found a crime that Stalin committed that I could demonstrate with primary source evidence and publish on it, then when anybody called me a Stalinist, I could point to that work and say, "Oh, look at that! Look at that! I found it." But I haven't found it. So therefore, it makes me more vulnerable to this accusation that, well, he's just biased against Stalin, biased in favor of Stalin, and he says that Stalin never committed any crime. I didn't say Stalin never committed any crimes. I said I haven't found any crime that Stalin committed. When I started to investigate the Katyn massacre, and I'd gone a little ways in, and I started to realize that, that all the chips were falling in the other direction, that it starting to look more and more like the Soviets didn't do it. I said, part of me said, well, this is very interesting. The other part of me said, damn it, if I'd been able to write a book that said the Soviets were guilty, I could carry that book around at any time. Anytime anybody called me a Stalinist, I could wave this book in their face and say, no, I proved that Stalin was guilty of the Katyn massacred thousands and thousands of Poles. I can't say that, because I haven't found any crimes that he committed. Maybe someday, you can bet on this, if someday I find evidence that Stalin committed a crime, I will publish about it. And then I'll carry it around in my hip pocket and say, don't call me a Stalinist. That's what's going on.
Okay. And then finally, what are you planning on researching in the future? I know you alluded to that book you're writing with your Russian friend. What's his name again?
Vladimir.
Vladimir, about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Are there any other topics you're looking towards researching in the future?
Well, there's a lot, you know. Who knows? Who knows what comes next? Uh, a lot depends upon what additional evidence becomes available,
Mm.
becomes published, right? A lot depends on that. Um, recently, hundreds and hundreds of interrogations of people in and around the Moscow trials has become uh, has become been published, and I've been reading that and making notes on it. It's not relevant to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact project. I sort of have in the back of my mind that I might do something with that. Um, I've been asked by some of the European publishers to publish a sort of single volume work on Trotsky. You know, because my work on Trotsky is scattered over like 4 or 5 different books.
Uh-huh.
And who's going to read that? So if you could just write one book on Trotsky, maybe with references to these other things, sort of summing up what you've done, I think that might be useful. I think that Trotskyism is a very negative phenomenon on the left, and I think that most Trotskyists don't realize that. Most of them have fallen prey to the anti-Stalin paradigm and just take on faith that Stalin was committed all these crimes and that Trotsky was this honorable, principled revolutionary. None of that's true. I have a little book called Trotsky's Lies, which I wrote some years ago, 2018, something like that, where I demonstrate that you can show that Trotsky was a liar, lied all the time, without even using documents from the former Soviet archives, just by studying his writings of the 1930s and then putting that beside, for example, comparing that his articles to what material was available then. For example, Trotsky would say in his writings in the 30s, and he wrote voluminously in the 30s, he would say, "Oh well, I'm summarizing the situation as described in L'Humanité, the French communist newspaper, or in some other source, right?" So when I read those things, I got those copies of those articles from those 1930s newspapers and put them aside. You have to be able to read French, Russian, German, you know, and put them beside what Trotsky was writing, and say he wasn't accurately saying that. He was lying about what was in those articles.
Mm.
You know, he was saying this is in the article, it's not in the article. My book on Lenin's the fraud of the Testament of Lenin. I have a chapter on how Trotsky lied about. He was in exile by that time. Lied about Lenin's testament. God knows why. He published a whole little book on it, and I checked a lot of the statements that he made in that book, and they're false. Okay, they're demonstrably false, and he had to know they were false. Take a look. But so I think that a work on Trotsky that tried to draw all these threads together would be useful. And beyond that, I can't tell you. It really depends upon what. Oh, with one more. So Stephen Kotkin, up until recently, of Princeton University. Now he's moved full time to the Hoover Institution in Stanford, California, is going to come out this next year, so he says, with the third volume of his 3-volume biography of Stalin. Now, I wrote one book about the second volume, which is terrible. The first volume has got some bad things in it, but it has a lot of good things in it because that's only Stalin's life up to 1927, and he's not supposed to have committed any crimes up to 1927. That's not so bad. It shows that Kotkin can do good research if he wants to. The second volume is terrible. The third volume is going to be up until Stalin's death, so I'm expecting that it's going to be another, anti-communist work. And I've got to make a lot of time for that because the first 2 volumes were were very long. You're talking 700-800-page books, 900-page books. In the second volume that I wrote my book, his second volume that I wrote my book, critiquing it, my book called Stalin Waiting for the Truth, there are over 5,000 footnotes in Kotkin's book. Now, of course, some of them are to trivial matters, but all the ones that supposedly document crimes or misdeeds or whatever by Stalin, I had to go and obtain all that material, read it, study it, to check, to see if Kotkin was being honest. And of course, he's not being honest. So when I wrote my preface to that book, I said, if you don't have Kotkin's book, you just read my book. If you got Kotkin's book, read my book, and then you can use Kotkin's book as a doorstop because the damn thing is big and fat. but it's really full of lies. I'm expecting something along those lines of his third volume, but that's supposed to come out this next year. And if it does, I probably have to set aside a year just to study that one book.
Okay.
The sources in it. So, those projects are going to take me a long time. If I get to do them all, that would be good.
I understand. Yeah, that sounds interesting. Am I confused, or wasn't the Hoover Institute CIA funded for anti-Soviet propaganda?
Yes, I should have said something about the Hoover Institute. If somebody works for the Hoover Institute, they're not interested in the truth. The Hoover Institution, actually, that's what they call themselves. The Hoover Institution is the best funded and best known anti-communist research institute in the world. Now, it also promotes other aspects of far right-wing, pro-capitalist, free enterprise stuff, right? It publishes stuff promoting free enterprise, all the stuff that Donald Trump loves, presumably, right? And lots of other, the Heritage Institution. There's a lot of these groups around, especially in the United States. But the Hoover Institution, a big part of it, is history of the communist movement and the Soviet Union. They have an enormous library. I've been there 2 or 3 times. Archives, papers, and they don't publish anything that doesn't fit their ideological framework. So, and of course and Kotkin just moved from Princeton to the Hoover, so presumably they're treating him at Hoover even better than they treated him at Princeton, which is hard to believe. It's very important to understand that if you're going to discover the truth in any scientific enterprise, and by scientific I mean evidence-based enterprise, whether it's astrophysics or engineering or history, okay? These are evidence-based fields of inquiry. If you're going to discover the truth in any evidence-based field of inquiry, you have to strive for objectivity, which means you have to cast doubt on, question your own preconceived ideas, as well as those of others. Of course, it's easier to question those of others than your own. And then you have to give a specially generous reading to any primary source evidence that seems to oppose or go against your own preconceived idea, and you have to go out of your way to give a more generous reading to a more skeptical reading to any evidence to confirm preconceived ideas, right? Because you don't want to be trapped in your own preconceived ideas. We've all got preconceived ideas and biases. You don't want to be trapped by them so that you just see them replicated over and over again in everything you do. If you want to discover the truth, you have to question these things. So that means you'd have to strive for as much objectivity as you possibly can. And this is well understood in the hard sciences. That's why they have laboratories, double-blind studies, and all kinds of stuff, right? Historians, any evidence-based field of study, field of inquiry has to do that. And that, in the field of Soviet history, is a very rare commodity. And if you go and work for the Hoover Institution, you're basically declaring to the world that you're never going to be objective. You're only going to write anti-communist stuff. I mean, why were you doing that? At least if you're at Princeton, I mean, has all kinds of problems. It's elitist and all this kind of stuff. But it's not like the Princeton administration comes down on you and says we're going to fire you unless you say nasty things about Stalin, right? It's not as blatant as that. But in a place like Hoover, it is. Uh-huh. So you can write them off. Okay? Anybody who publishes, anybody who's right from the Hoover Institution, that they're going to be lying about Soviet history.
Absolutely. Professor Grover Furr, this has been a wonderful conversation. Where can people best find your work, and do you have any parting words?
I have a webpage. If you go to Google and say Grover Furr's homepage, I'm sure you'll find it. All of my published articles are there for downloading. There's a list of all my books there. You can, and where to buy them. And you can also email me. My email address is there. I'm Furg, Furrg, at Montclair, montclair.edu, Furg at montclair.edu. And I'll be glad to hear from you. And I'll respond to any emails you send me. Be very glad to do that. Thank you for this interview. I've enjoyed it, and I hope it's helpful to you and to your audience.
It has. Thank you so much. You have a wonderful Saturday.
You too. Bye-bye.
This episode of the Pokepreet Pod has been brought to you by our generous members on our Patreon. If you'd like to become one of them, go to patreon.com/thepokepreetpod. Thank you. What the fuck? Glory to Stalin, I barely made it. And a shout out to our one and only Marshal of the Soviet Union tier member, Mateus T. If you'd like a shout out too, consider donating to our Patreon. Thank you.